I decreased my trainer difficulty to 30% in this race. I feel that's the only thing that can save me today.
Welcome to stage 6 of Tour de Zwift 2025. Today we are going to be racing on the coast-to-coast route. It's a relatively new course that's almost 27 kilometers long and has over 160 meters of elevation. It starts on the southern course and finishes in the new Jarvis Island. It's a rolling course with several bigger kickers and one proper KOM at the end. So there is plenty of opportunities to get dropped, especially that in the recent weeks I've lost a ton of fitness. I have completely missed stages 4 and 5 because I've got horrible flu with stupidly high fever. So this was my first race after basically 3 weeks of little to no riding. I can feel I lost fitness, but I guess this race is going to show how much. As usual in Tour de Zwift, the front group consisted of A and A+ riders. There was even an ex-pro road racer, Kasper van Volzach from Denmark, who even competed in Summer Olympics in 2012. So you can imagine that the start of the race was pretty juicy, and you can see here on the flat and even downhill sections that the peloton is already spreading. It's nothing major, but it is a sign about how this race is going to go. Now, if you've watched my last race, you might remember that I experimented with 50% trainer difficulty and it went really well. I ended on the 6th spot, but it was a pretty flat course, so the advantage from the trainer difficulty wasn't as prominent. And this time I'm going to try even lower settings. I'm putting it down to 30%, which should help me on these rollers, and you can see right here on this little kicker that I only needed to shift down 1 gear instead of probably 2, 3 or even 4 if I had it on 100%. And I would like to remind everyone that that is the main benefit of lower trainer difficulty. It doesn't make you go easier, you just don't need to shift as much. So I'm hoping that's going to help me on this rolling course, especially since I definitely lost some fitness. Here you can watch a first significant attack of the race, and it was actually a pretty nice move. The guy steered to the left to deny the riders behind him draft, and he actually managed to get a little gap with this maneuver. Before this race, I've set myself 2 tiers of goals. My best case scenario would obviously be to stay with this group until the finishing sprint. But since there is the Jarvis KOM at the end, I needed to be realistic, so my second goal would be to stay with the group at least until the base of the climb, and ideally stay with the group for at least some time on the Jarvis KOM. Now, was that a realistic goal? I wasn't sure at this point. I didn't know how much fitness did I lose. I wasn't sure how strong the group I would be riding with was. And there are at least 2 spots before the climb on the course where I can get dropped. The first one is the little climb that goes from the coast to the desert roundabout and then continues to the entrance of the Titan's Grove. And the second spot is the very shallow but very steady section towards the Italian villas. Obviously the question is how hard the group would hammer on those climbs. But considering that all we've done so far was basically a flat section and I already have my heart rate in deep 170s, I didn't have the best expectations. However, I'm glad that I'm waiting this long to race again, because although I felt I've lost some fitness, I didn't feel any medical problems like I would get short of breath or that I would be coughing or anything, so I think that waiting until I was feeling fine was a good move. So now we are exiting the coast and approaching the little climb that goes towards the desert roundabout, and honestly I would consider it a disaster if I got dropped already here. Obviously it can happen because some of the riders can really hammer down, but thankfully even though the effort was quite hard, it was quite manageable. It looked for a moment that the front half might get separated from the group, but we actually managed to catch them, and now we were approaching the second part of this climb that goes from the desert until the start of the Titan's Grove. And this is the harder part, to be honest, so I really went out of the saddle and hammered down because I knew that after this climb There was downhill and chance to recover, so I didn't want to get dropped here. It is also easier to do mentally, because if you know that after the climb there is going to be another climb or even flat section, you know that the group might continue to push, but when there is a downhill, you know that you are pretty much guaranteed at least some recovery. But I ended up the climb with 185 BPM, and to be completely honest with you, I felt that I might actually get dropped on the second kicker that goes to the Italian villas. I simply were nowhere near as good as the rest of this group that at this point had about 25 people, so at least that is something I might consider a success. But yeah, didn't feel good here. There was actually one more problem for me. I don't know if you've noticed on the descent, but the group actually continued to push even on the descent, so I didn't really recover well. Even here I have almost 170 BPM, and after a pretty long descent I would expect having about 150, 155 max. So I was quite afraid at this point. I was afraid to be dropped and I was afraid to be hurting. But at least I have to say that the lower trainer difficulty helped me with not having to deal with so much torque and so much shifting when hitting even the smallest uphills. There has been quite lively discussion under my video about trainer difficulty and even under my community post where I asked if you use lower trainer difficulty. And some of you guys have pretty strong opinions on that, so hopefully you won't judge me too harshly here, but as you can see, even with lower trainer difficulty, I'm almost getting dropped here on the false flat going to the bridge. And there's one thing that I don't know and that I would like to ask you, especially if you are using the sauce for Zwift. When that close gap message appears on the screen, does that mean that I'm already losing draft? Does anybody know? If you do, please let me know in the comments, because I think that that is something that you really need to dial your position in the pack for. I suspect you are losing draft if that happens, but I would like to make sure. So as you can see, we've started the second kicker that goes to the Italian villas. The group is spreading somewhat, but I'm still somehow managing to keep up. But it's super tiring for me at this point. I think the rest of the group is okay, because this is basically not a climb. It's just a little bump on the road. But at this point in the race, I'm tired. I have 183 BPM, which for me is really quite a lot. And I'm barely hanging onto this group. But I also don't want to get dropped, so I'm really pushing, even if that means that I will blow up in the KOM. So that was the summit, and at this point I was quite convinced I would make it to the base of the ZWIFT KOM. But as you will be actually able to see in a little while, the group kicked up the pace and I was almost getting dropped even on the flat section. Sure, at this point I'm doing only about Z2 or Z3 effort, but I'm still having over 170 BPM and I'm really struggling to even stay in the draft. So I knew at this point that my breaking point in this race was approaching. I would actually love to see how I would do in this race if I didn't lose the 3 weeks of riding. Because in the last race I felt probably the most fit I've ever been. And I was actually getting excited that I would enter Zwift games in a decent shape. But oh well, it's still about 3 weeks to go, so I'm going to put everything into my training and maybe I'll get my fitness back. In the last banner I've received the featherweight power up, which was actually pretty fortunate before the climb. We've just recently started climbing the ZWIFT KOM and I'm determined to stay with this group for as long as possible. The start of this climb is nothing too severe. You can see on the profile that there are some little orange sections, but it isn't anything that you need dedicated climber for. I wanted to utilize my power up as well as possible, so I decided to pop it here on the start of the first orange section, and I went out of the saddle because at this point I felt I had more strength in my legs than my lungs. So I entered the low cadence mode and if anything I at least got some good leg workout. But as you will be able to see in a very short while, that was also the last thing I was able to do in this race. Entering this right-hand turn, you can see the group is actually splitting up. There are some attacks at the front, and I knew I wouldn't be able to keep up with it. I knew it from the start of the climb, but this was actually the very point where I didn't simply have the strength to continue. But that doesn't actually mean that this race was unsuccessful. Firstly, I realized that I didn't completely lose my fitness, which was a pleasant surprise. And secondly, I learned that the lower trainer difficulty setting was actually helpful for racing. Like I said, it won't help you to go faster, you still need to put out the same watts, but the fact that you don't need to shift nearly as much is super helpful. Basically, the only time where I needed to shift multiple gears at once was when I was going out of the saddle. That was the only occasion, and that was happening anyway with higher trainer difficulty setting. I wouldn't actually recommend you to go below 30%, because if you go too low, you won't get the elevation feedback when you are riding. Which means that when you start climbing, you might actually get left out in the dust by the group because you won't react as fast. As for the result of this race, at this point it is quite clear that I won't get caught by anyone anymore, so I'm going to finish on 29th spot, which is something that in retrospective I am pretty happy with. But for good measure, I popped the featherweight and decided to do at least a hint of a sprint, but it was about as impressive as me climbing the ZWIFT KOM. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. Only 15% of you who watch my content on a regular basis are subscribed, and it really helps the channel to grow. See you next time, guys!